So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our April webinar, Sharpening the Saw, Continuous Learning for Boards. I'm happy that you could join us. I'm going to go over a couple of webinar logistics since this is the first time we've had a webinar, actually, since many of you had school board elections. So for the sake of our new board members that might be joining in, just a few minutes to go over the logistics. As with every webinar, we encourage questions. That's why we're here to answer your questions. So if you have one, please type it in the Q&A box. We don't like to use the chat box. So by putting your question into the Q&A box, that allows the presenters to see it and not the other panelists or not the other participants. At the end of this webinar, when you get out of it, a little survey will pop up automatically. It's a 3-question survey. And we just ask you to take the minute or two that it takes to complete the survey because your feedback is what helps us to improve every time we do these webinars. So thank you in advance for doing that. And this webinar is being recorded, as you know. And in a couple of days, anyone who registered for this webinar will receive an email with a link to the recording, the slide deck that you will see, as well as any handouts that we reference during the webinar. As always, we put the recording on our website, and it can be found under a tab called Resources. And under that, there's another tab called Webinar Archives. So all of the webinars from the last 3 years can be found there if you'd like to view this webinar later. Finally, that number down below for technical difficulties, that'll get you to Amy in our office. So if you have any trouble with the Zoom, please just give her a call and she hopefully can figure it out and solve it for you. So again, thank you all very much for joining us today. So here's a quick look at our agenda. I'm going to spend a few minutes at the outset kind of setting our context and talking about why continuous board learning is important and how that is reflected in the DQS governance standards. We'll have our panelists give us good examples of how they do board learning and developments in each of their districts. If we have time, I'd like to go over a couple policies that speak to board education and development, board education and learning. My computer is acting kind of slow today. There we go. Including what a policy and a policy governance board may look like. And then we'll close out our hour together. So let's begin. Before we get started, I wanted to before we get to the how we do board learning and board development, I wanted just to take a step back and look at this question of why. Why is continuous learning for boards important? Why did we at the VSBA think that it was important enough actually to do a webinar on it? So that's a fair question, and I'd like to speak about it for just a minute. There's actually, the research on public school governance is not very extensive, but what has been done to date is interesting. Multiple research studies suggest school boards can have an effect on student outcomes. So let's briefly look at one of those studies. First, we had the Lighthouse Project. Back in the late 1990s, the Iowa Association of School Boards launched the Lighthouse Study to examine the role of school boards and their impact on student achievements. The research team set out to answer 2 questions, which you can see here. Are school boards in achieving districts different from those in achieving districts? And if so, how can all school boards become more like those in districts with high achievement? So just for your reference, the word achievement in this context refers to student achievement and outcomes. The researchers took a group of similar school districts with unusually high student performance and a group of similar districts with unusually low student performance. They then examined the knowledge, beliefs, and actions of school board members in both of these groups. And what they discovered was interesting. There were indeed distinct differences between higher and lower achieving districts that were observed. Obviously, school boards do not directly cause or prevent student learning. However, The findings of the Lighthouse study show that the beliefs and decisions and actions of school boards do directly impact the conditions within schools that in turn has influence on student achievements. So in other words, the study suggested that board actions are a key part of a culture of improvement within school districts. So what are some of these actions of school boards that directly and positively impact the conditions within schools that in turn help the district improve student achievements? There are several, but for our purposes today, I would like to call one out in particular, and that is board learning or board development, as we sometimes refer to it. In the high achieving districts, board members regularly participated in group learning activities such as work and study sessions. Moreover, these boards created opportunities where inquiry and discussion happened before making a decision. Contrast this with lower achieving districts, where board members said that they never learned together as a team, except when the superintendent or staff presented them with some data. So after the initial success of the Lighthouse study, it was expanded to become a multi-year study with 3 separate phases that built on one another. The second Lighthouse study, phase 2, looked at how boards learn to lead their districts to become high performing. This body provided evidence about what school boards need to know and do to function in a manner that positively impacts a school district's efforts to improve student achievement. 5 key leadership roles for the school board to improve student learning surfaced. And again, we won't go over all 5 of these, but I want to focus on one. One of these key leadership roles is learning together as a board team. And what does that look like? It looks like these. So since the Lighthouse study, there's been more research conducted on the question of what makes an effective school board. The Center of Public Education, which is the research arm of the National School Boards Association, conducted a meta-analysis of 10 studies and reports on school board leadership, including the Lighthouse studies. The result is a report entitled 8 Characteristics of Effective School Boards. This is one of the most reputable research-informed lists of attributes of effective school boards there is. One of these 8 characteristics of an effective school board speaks to our topic today, which is learning. Gosh, here it is. Effective school boards take part in team development and training, sometimes with their superintendents, to build shared knowledge, values, and commitments for their improvement efforts. The research on effective school boards and good governance was used to help draft the governance standards in the district quality standards. As a quick refresher, for those of you who aren't familiar with DQS, the legislature in 2022 passed an act, Act 127, which among many things requires each Vermont school district to meet the school district quality standards adopted by rule of the Agency of Education regarding the business, facilities management and safety, and governance practices of the school districts. Vermont school board members led the drafting process for the governance standards at the request of the AOE. In 2022, a task force formed composed of 11 school board members from around Vermont. Over the course of several months, this task force studied the research, including the Lighthouse study, and came up with 14 governance standards that are grouped into 3 different areas or categories. They are governance priorities, governance protocols, and governance processes. These standards were adopted largely unchanged in the final version of Rule Series 100 in 2023, and they will take effect on July 1st of this year. So this next slide shows you the standard that speaks to board development. It's Governance Standard 113.2.4, and it's located or it's listed under the governance protocols of the governance standards. And the protocols is basically a group of 4 standards that speaks to ways that boards do their work together. So it makes sense that continuous learning would be one of those standards because it speaks to how a board does its work. And in order to do its work, to do its work effectively, it requires continuous learning and development. So what does that mean for us school board members? Starting on July 1st of this year, boards will be expected to provide members with opportunities to learn. For many boards, this is nothing new. Many of you already do board development, and we will hear from board members in just a minute about how their boards do this. For those boards that aren't yet doing any board development, I hope that the research will convince you to try it in the future. Yes, it does require an investment. It's an investment of time and in some cases money. However, the return on that investment is a good one. By taking this one action, the action of board learning, and ideally learning as a team with the superintendent, the board will increase its knowledge and skills. And by doing this, it will improve its own performance. Because as those researchers who have studied the issue of school board governance have shown, effective boards are a key part of a culture of improvement within school districts, and they do impact the conditions in schools, which in turn has influence on student achievement. And isn't that why we all do the work that we do? To support our students and give them every opportunity to learn, grow, and achieve. So that's my spiel on the why board learning matters. And now I'd like to turn to how we do it. So we are so fortunate to have with us today 3 board members who are willing and available to share with us some of what their boards do in terms of board development and training. In addition to serving on their district boards, on their own local school boards, they also serve as regional reps to the Vermont School Boards Association. Mark Koenig is one of the 2 Addison reps. Neil Odell is one of the 2 from Windsor. And Jim Salzgiver is one of 2 regional reps from the Bennington region. So if any of you on this webinar are in one of those regions, you may have remember receiving some emails or communications from your regional reps. I also want to mention that Jim's board uses policy governance as its system of governance. So for those who may not know what policy governance is, it's a trademarked governance system that was created in the 1970s by John and Miriam Carver. So if you serve on a board that has officially policy governance, such as Winooski, Mount Mansfield, Rutland Northeast, Jim will speak a bit about what board learning looks like for his board, which is a policy governance board. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn to the panel. And I think we'll just go in the order that you were on that slide. So Mark Koenig from Addison, if you don't mind kicking us off and tell us about some of the great things that your board does to continue its learning.
Okay, so I am Mark Koenig. I'm the chair of the Addison Northwest School District. And when we consolidated about 10 years ago, we started, so we're not policy governance formal, but we run by policy. So we started putting policies in place as a new board running the new district, some of which we were asking the superintendent to provide us with reports on equity, on class size, on curriculum, XYZ. And in the beginning, the first few years, we would just have written reports. They would be attached to the superintendent's report. And it was sort of hit and miss whether or not board members read them completely. And even if they did read them, did they understand them? Many of us were fairly new to being a board member. And as we all know, being in education means that you swim in acronyms. So it's very hard sometimes to follow what's going on. And at some point, we decided maybe we should have presentations of each of these reports. And so now we have an actual annual calendar and we know which reports are coming for which meetings. We meet twice a month. And so one of our meetings each month has somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour of what we call board education. And typically, it is one of these reports, and we will have whoever is sort of responsible for that area of our district present. So it might be our director of student support services or our director of learning or the superintendent or principal. Um, and I kind of went through the last since we started this school year, we've had 14 different board education systems, some of them being these reports and some other aspects that I'll get into. But our reports have included our equity assessments and strategic support. We've had our class size and course information report. We've had special education report. We've had our curriculum development, universal pre-K, proficiency, and assessment. So we have our expert in our district come and walk us through it, and that happens every year. There'll be a slight change in what is reported or how they report it. What's nice is that the longer that we have people on the board, the more in depth we can get those reports to be. So we might say, that's great. Maybe next year's report, we can focus on a narrower band because we now understand the basics. But the first time we got these reports 8 years ago, it was really baby steps. Like, this is what equity means. This is what an assessment is. And it allowed the board to understand the decisions we were making, how it was actually having real world impact on our schools in a day-to-day basis. And it helped us make better decisions and make better budgeting determinations. So sometimes we'll say, can you come back to us like with some additional information next meeting so that we clarify something? And other times it's just, let's take a note that next year's report will focus more on a subset of this issue. Along with the reports, we also just get information from people. So most of our board meetings take place in the high school's library, but we do visit our elementary schools. So each of our schools gets one meeting a year where the board goes there and we get an update from the principal on the students, the faculty, the facility. We take a tour of the building. If there's been any projects going on, we can see how the roof went on or how the new paint job went. They might show us artwork. It also allows more local residents, if they want to attend, much more before Zoom became a thing, but it was a way to have those community members not feel like they had to trek all the way to the high school if they wanted to be part of this. So we hear from our elementary school principals, our middle school principal, our high school principal. We have a tech center just down the road. And so since we pay into that, we have one of our meetings where the superintendent of the tech center talks about where they are, what they're doing, how our school is interacting with them. We have our auditor come in once the audit is done and walk us through the audit, give us any information. We get to ask questions. We've developed a couple of different funds based on recommendations of the auditors, and they have walked us through what we should do, and that has helped us stabilize some of our financial issues. And then this past Monday, we had our annual meeting with our legislative representatives. So they talked us mostly through 454, where they are, what they're thinking, what they're hearing in the hallways. So we spent a good hour talking with our reps about what's happening in Montpelier. So that's most of our education. Then we also have 2 retreats a year. We brought in Debbie actually in this past August, and she walked us through the basics of the new DQSs, like what we were expecting, including what we're talking about right now. So that was a 2-hour retreat to start us off our year, trying to make sure that we were prepared for the coming July transition. So that's how we do our education.
Thanks, Mark. We had a question pop up about something you said, this idea of moving meetings to different locations in schools. She's wondering, how does this work with open meeting law and requirements to have the meeting recorded? Are those things difficult? for you to do when you
Well,
move locations?
when we have our initial organizational meetings, first meeting in March after the election, we set the calendar for where meetings are going to be. So it is on, all of the public is on notice that such and such date meeting will happen at this school, such and such date meeting, so that it is known, we announce it, and then we just record via Zoom. Um, so people can log in through Zoom and it's recorded and it's available on our website if they need to see it. I think the only thing we really have some problem with is we tend to be in the gym of the elementary school, so there's a lot more echoing that happens in those rooms than does happen within the library at the high school. But it seems to function fine.
Good. So you put the location right there on your work plan for the whole
Yep.
year for the calendar. So you know, so everybody knows ahead of time that
Yep.
what meeting's going to be held at their school. That's good.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So next we'll ask Neil to tell us a little bit about what he does and his board does up there in Norway.
Thank you, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be with my colleagues from the VSBA on this. I will admit, so some of the stuff that I will share with you today is things that we have done in the past. We just don't necessarily do them currently. I joined the Norwich board, I think like way back in 2009. And I think like a lot of board members, I was thinking to myself, how hard could this be? Right? We just show up at a meeting a couple of times a month. We're going to make some decisions about education and it's all going to go smoothly. Um, I learned I learned a lot in those first few years. And I learned a lot of stuff that I think a lot of folks don't know prior to joining the board. And it was the basics about board operation. In particular, one of the things that struck me that I needed to get up to speed with fairly quickly was open meeting law. And I have found over the years that a lot of boards get bogged down in basic operations, which then can sometimes detract from their ability to actually get on and do the work that a lot of them, signed up for, thought that they were going to be involved with. And by maybe making a mistake in the basic operation, cause an entire conversation to derail and never actually gets to a good discussion on things. And it was many, many years ago that I was attending a VSBA annual conference. And there was an activity that we had. I think it might have even been sort of a little fun time activity where the executive director at the time made up a Jeopardy game based on open meeting law. And it was a really engaging way to get board members to sort of participate more than just reading the statute and sort of understanding, okay, so here are the various things that I need to know about open meeting law, like what's a meeting, what's not a meeting, can I communicate this way, can I not communicate that way, what do my minutes need to have in them, and things. The Jeopardy game was sort of presented a little bit more in a scenario format that caused you to think a little bit about. So take your knowledge of what open meeting law says, but then apply it to a hypothetical situation and how do you respond? That was a really fun activity I found, and I stole it. I flat out stole it from VSBA and I brought it to my local board. And we used it at a retreat, and folks liked it. And I continued that for a while afterwards. And I actually used the first few minutes of every board meeting to basically present a scenario of open meeting law to board members. And then I solicited for like, so what's the right answer to this question? How would you respond? And I think it was a really fun and engaging way of getting board members to take the law and then apply it to a particular scenario so that when something like that comes up in the future, they're like, oh, wait a minute, I know how to handle this because we talked about this as a board meeting. Um, uh, I will admit, I've put together a quick little Jeopardy game that I can share with you all right now. I'm maybe going to look at Jim and Mark as my two contestants. But I will warn you ahead of time, I have not had a chance to update the game with all of the changes in open meeting law since we first did this. So I want you all to consider this as an example and not necessarily reflective of current law. So don't walk away from this meeting thinking that Neil just told you that this is how you should respond. But I just wanted to give you a sense as to what it was like and how we used it. So give me 1 second to tee this up. All right, are you seeing my Jeopardy screen? Okay, Jim, I'm gonna, unfortunately, not all of these little guys are filled out, so I'm gonna pick one for you. We're gonna go to Are We Meeting for $200. Are you ready for the question, Jim?
I'll give it my all.
Okay, the superintendent emails a board packet to all board members in advance of the regular board meeting. It includes the agenda materials for the consent agenda and minutes from the previous meeting. A board member disagrees with the wording of a motion in the minutes and sends an email to the entire group requesting that an amendment be made prior to the meeting. Is this a violation, Jim?
Well, I would tend to say that sending the email is not necessarily a violation in of itself. If it gets discussed prior to the meeting, then that would by essentially, if it gets discussed by the board ahead of the meeting, that would create a violation situation.
I like your answer, Jim. I like your answer. And this at the time was the response that we had put together at the meeting that VSBA had. All right, going to go back to our board. Mark, I'm going to go down here. I'm going to hit you up with the $600 question if you are ready.
Buildings and grounds, west, doors, one board. Well, it is officially a subcommittee of the group. If it was created by the school board, and this is probably more on the current law, you would need to warn it and take minutes, even though there is only one board member. If it's an ad hoc committee that just kind of meets on its own and the school board did not create it, then maybe not. It might just be a group of like-minded people who want to talk about things. But if it really is a subset of the school board, then I would err on the side of caution and say, yes, you should do that.
I like your answer, Mark. I like your answer. All right. Debbie, you thought you were going to get out of this without being a participant in the game, but I think I'm going to pull you in.
That's fine.
All right. Now, I will admit, remember I said before, gang, that not all of these have been updated based on current open meeting law, so it could be that things might have changed. What do you think, Debbie?
I would say he sees the board made a motion to accept the superintendent's recommendation with regard to teacher discipline. Nothing more on the issue was recorded in the minutes. I mean, nothing more on the issue was recorded in the minutes, not even the decision.
Right. So one of the things that we found with this format, right, is that generates this type of discussion, right? So you've been given a scenario, you feel like you don't have enough information. Sometimes that discussion is just as valuable as trying to win the game here. And I will admit that a lot of times these answers are a little nuanced, right? But
Right.
what I want people to take away from it is I think sometimes what I have found in my own local district, developing a method of delivering the training that is a little bit more engaging maybe than read this piece of material and let's come back to discuss it, sometimes makes the learning sink in a little bit better. And that is our Jeopardy.
That's great. I love that. I love that. I mean, it's a game format where you're using scenarios because often we use scenarios in training to practice, right? And to apply our learning. So we'll do, here's the scenario. I even do something called overstep, oversight, or not a good idea, and present boards with scenarios where they have to decide if this is a case of the board overstepping or doing what they should be doing, which is their oversight role, or maybe it's not either, but it's just not a good idea. So those games are always really fun to do. And I love the idea of doing Jeopardy. I think that's worth updating that game and making sure that it is accurate and reflects the accurate law. So thank you, Neil. That's awesome.
No, you're welcome. And I can't just maybe finally, I can't stress enough the number of times that I've seen boards, not just school boards, but select boards as well too, in the newspaper
Yeah.
for just not following good process, whether it's open meeting law or some other local policy. Um, we could put all of that stuff behind us and focus on just getting the real work of the board done. If all of us, I think, had a really good understanding of how we're supposed to operate, what the open meeting law is, it just makes things go so much smoother. And I think it's time really, really well spent by a board member.
Learning how those processes work. Yeah, absolutely. Because they're there to help us get our work done. They're not there to get in our way. So definitely. Good job. Love that. All right, Jim, what do you have for us from Bennington?
Okay. Well, Debbie actually asked me to focus on, as she mentioned, um, we are a 3 district supervisory union. So we have 3 district boards and then an SU board. 2 of those district boards are formally policy governance boards. So we actually have a mix of both. And so Debbie did want me to touch on policy governance. She's the head of a policy governance board as well. And policy governance is, in my mind, it has pluses and minuses. But on the plus side, Mark started off talking about what his district does in terms of reports. Policy governance essentially forces you in that direction because with policy governance, it sets up some really good basics of you do have to discuss in detail what your ends policies are. So really looking at, deeply into what are the goals of the district, defining those, writing them, sharing them with the community. And then there are a bunch of policies that go beyond that, that define how you work with a superintendent, between superintendent and board, et cetera. And it's a really good formal structure to give boards some direction on, how they should best operate. When I said it's positives and negatives, policy governance can also be it's intended to be put into place in a very strict fashion. So it can be, sometimes feel a little bit limiting too from the standpoint of boards, and that's what some boards view as a negative to it. But I go back to when I first started on a school board. So this is kind of like Neil back in the early days. When I first joined a school board, I have to admit I didn't really understand what board governance was quite all about. Okay, I'm turning purple here. Let me try to go in and out on that. Well, they say okay. So that sometimes happens with mine. But when I first joined a single town school district school board, I have to admit that a lot of us didn't really, as we were, getting new school board members and all, a lot of us really didn't know our job very well. And one of the most important things that policy governance forces you to do, and I think, most good boards do this, whether they're policy governance or not, is to really focus on the roles and responsibilities of the parties to the process. That's the superintendent, that's the board, that's the community, and how they all tie together. And, that was, back in the old days, I think that a lot of school board members would come in and think that their job was to give the superintendent guidance on how they do their job. And, that if you start to develop some board knowledge, governance knowledge, and experience with boards, you realize that's a very bad sort of direction for a board to go in. So, policy governance provides a structure that's really pretty good to, and, what I would argue is we went through a long process of getting to know policy governance before we actually adopted it. We spent, well over a year, closer to 2 years, discussing policy governance, having sessions with outside experts and all before we ever adopted policy governance. And I would tend to argue that for any board, whether you accept policy governance or not, when you go through that kind of, again, this is training that, Debbie's talking about, boards function a lot better when they're together training, trying to learn something. That was a hugely positive experience for our boards to go through that process, to debate what this means for our board and how we should operate. And in a way, we adopted policy governance in the district that I'm on the school board for. But even if we hadn't, we would still be probably operating in a manner pretty consistent with the policy governance guidelines. So I think that's one point that I would tend to think provides a lot of support for Debbie's points that school boards, if they work together very closely on an issue or a variety of issues, then they learn how to function together at a much higher level. I think just to based upon the nature of this session, I also wanted to get into a few of the other things we do from a training perspective in our district. One of the key ones really is actually new school board member orientation. And I think with a policy governance board, it's even more important because people come on and they don't have a clue of what policy governance means. And so you have to actually spend some real time explaining what policy governance means. But at the same time, what you're doing, even if you're not a policy governance board, explaining the roles and responsibilities of the various parties is really important to, if you have a school board member who comes onto the board because they have one issue they want to get across, and it's like, okay, that's not your job. Your job is to function as a board member, providing, your part of discussion on a whole range of issues. And if you're going to be a good functioning board member, then you have to redefine the way you thought your job was going to be defined. Some of the other things I found, just to kind of throw out because they might be useful. In training, like Mark brought up, coming up with different topics that are kind of good for the board to understand. We've taken that. Actually, what we've done is we come up with, this is usually through the agenda planning sessions. We come up with a variety of topics that we think that school board members should learn about, and that's, something like one of the ones I like the most was in our districts, we have a couple of programs called Anchor and Rise that are focused on, one is an in-district program intended to, specifically focused at dealing with kids who are on the autism spectrum and dealing with them within our system. The other one is associated with kids with real behavioral issues. And so these, two targeted programs that have actually been extremely successful within our district, and especially successful in being able to bring those kids back into the general, educational population, over time, we didn't really have a mechanism for our school board members to understand that, as a group. So, we do sessions on those. And those sessions are, the people who run the programs coming in, giving a really good overview, what the programs are, what they're intended to accomplish and what they are accomplishing. But it's the discussion amongst the board members, about those programs that tends to be really enlightening and really good from a board development perspective. Of course, we do the same with student achievement, where, that's a regular topic throughout the year that's on our, and again, policy governance gives us a we map out the whole year in advance of when we're going to have what kind of sessions and what kind of reporting. And, school student achievements, always a very, high item on that, priority list. Some other things that we do that are, I think, a little different than some, but very relevant in today's educational sort of situation. We've taken to, over the past few years, we at every month's set of board meetings, we have a legislative update that is very much based upon all the work done at VSBA to keep us all up to date on legislative issues. But we kind of tailor it to our districts and what it means for our districts and what are the key issues. And so that leads to, good discussions at the board level. One, trying to have all of our board members understand, whether they've read the VSBA updates or not, have them understand what's going on in the legislature and how it could impact us. That's also been very good from the standpoint of it's allowed us to, we have a variety of issues that we think it's important that we do opine on at the legislature, just to look out for our own district's interests. And that's provided us with a base for making those decisions as to when it is important for our district to speak up, for something that could have an impact on our ability to operate the way we historically have. So those are some of the elements that we talk about on a regular basis. But honestly, we're kind of on an ongoing basis. We're always looking at what are the next set of topics we should discuss as a board. Now, we do use, I'll say, especially on policy governance, is that you have new board members coming in. It's tough to keep them, they don't know what we give them an intro, but we also think it's extremely important for us to periodically use VSBA and, especially VSBA to do trainings on policy governance as a board, including the superintendent. So, we've used that as a resource to stay up. We also, frankly, we encourage, although, it's funny, I was talking to one of the board chairs the other day and talking about what she does on a regular basis. And, she talked about encouraging school board members to do certain training things. And, realizing that you can only encourage, you can't actually mandate it. But, we strongly encourage school board members to take part in these webinars and to take part of the opportunities for training that come through VSBA. So, those are, that kind of helps us, but we're always on the lookout for, what should school board members know to be able to do their jobs the right way. And, that'll continue to be, a focus, going forward, but it's good to just stay in that mindset of how are we going to, train our school board members. My own personal view, we don't do nearly a good enough job of it as it is, but, we're trying. And that's what, I think if you keep focused on it, and if your boards themselves have expectations of getting that sort of exposure to topics, then they ask for it. And, it's just sort of a good self-reinforcing thing to put in place.
Yeah, Neil.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that last part that Jim made, because that's what I have found locally as well too, is that VSBA, I think it does a great job of putting out opportunities there for board members to increase their learning and to engage. But we're all busy people. And what I was noticing on my own board was people just didn't have the time to do that, which is one of the reasons why I just basically forced the training on my board by setting aside a little time at the beginning of each meeting to cover like maybe one or two topics around open meeting. Like you have them at that moment in time, right? You have a captured audience. You might as well take the advantage of trying to impart a little bit of training at that point in time. knowing that people are very, very busy and their ability to get out and do some of these other things on their own is challenging.
Absolutely. One thing I wanted to mention as well is that when we do those training sessions on, I mentioned the Anchor and Rise programs when we, brought those people in. That was actually a couple of years ago, but we recorded all those sessions. And so it was given to essentially one of the boards, and then it was shared around to the other boards, and it's in our library of materials. So you get a new school board member on board, and if they want to learn about something, they have a place to go learn about it.
Yeah, sometimes we let perfection be the enemy of good enough, right? Like we don't have to offer it all the time. If we can, we don't even have to have a standalone training if we don't have the time or the resources to do it. I like what you're saying is how you make it part of your regular board meeting because your board members are already there, your superintendent's already there. So why not spend 10 to 15 minutes at some point during the board meeting to do a little bit of professional development? And that's what we do on our board is a scenario. And as Jim said, we are a policy governance scenario. So this is part of that continuous learning for our board, especially for the newer board members who are still kind of getting up to speed on how to apply policy governance. So we'll do a scenario and then we'll say, so board, what would you do? And it literally takes 10 minutes and it's kind of a good way to get our brains thinking too about school board work and governance because we all come rushing in at the last minute from our busy lives. And so it's a nice way just to transition our brains over to thinking about our role as board directors. So I like how you talked about, and it's free. It doesn't cost anything. So that was actually one of my questions for you all is, what would you do if your board doesn't budget for, well, first of all, does your board budget for continuous learning? Do you have a little bit of professional development funding in your budgets? Do you know?
Just in the past year, we decided to finally address that and put the money in.
Put the money in.
Historically, yeah, and I honestly, in the past when we've had, it hasn't been that expensive to like bring the VSBA in to do a session or something like that. So we've just been able to, even though it wasn't specifically budgeted, we've been able to do it. But, in the last year, we said, we really need to start budgeting for this. So we started to do that.
We don't have a specific line item for development itself, but we do have a line item for school board work. And so we'll adapt it. So, we pay VSBA sometimes, or we'll pay our district attorney to come in and give us a seminar on open meeting law or hazing, harassment, bullying. So we understand those aspects better, but it's not specifically called out as money for development.
Yeah. Who tends to organize your board training and your board learning? Is that usually done by your chair and the superintendent? Do you know?
For us, it's a combination where the superintendent and the chair sit down and figure out the next agenda or the next calendar year, kind of figure out what's going to happen, what should happen. I was going to say, Jim said something that struck me where the board sometimes decides on its own during a meeting that it doesn't know enough about a topic. And it takes a board that's comfortable enough with itself to say, I don't know. And then a lot of times our superintendent would say, would it help if I put together a small presentation for the next meeting to expand on this issue before you make any decisions? And so we'll sort of have an impromptu education just because we're in an area we don't feel comfortable enough with to make a good decision. And so she will come back in a week or a month, depending on what we need the timing on, and give us a small training on a new program or new set of rules or just some aspect that we didn't quite get.
Yeah, I will say for us, it's been mostly a combination of board chair and superintendent. I know when I was board chair, I perhaps used the role to sort of force the training on board members a little bit without them having a chance to say that they wanted it. And since I have stepped down from that board chair role, what I find myself doing more frequently is actually talking with the board chair saying, hey, I noticed at the last meeting, maybe we didn't quite get that motion just right, or however we handled things was a little um, not as good as it could have been. Perhaps maybe the board might benefit from a little bit of training at a future meeting. But so seeding those ideas with the current board chair, trying to, influence that pattern of behavior.
Good.
I think with us, it's the agenda planning sessions, and as I'm the SU chair, so over time, just working with the superintendent, saying, I have a list of another 10 possible topics for future training, and we just kind of we fit them in where it makes sense, or where it's been very busy times on our board. So, sometimes you can find time for training, and sometimes, it just isn't going to fit. But, we try to have in reserve a number of topics that, and, we'll have a discussion at a board meeting about, okay, I have this list. What sounds good to people? It's a good way to pull people in and see where the demand might actually be.
Yeah. There's a question here about, again, the money situation. Does your board typically vote to approve spending on in your budget for board trainings, or is it kind of absorbed by a different line item?
Part of the budget.
It's part of the budget.
We did have a discussion, as I said last year, because we're a policy governance board. There is one of our policies that says that we should be doing training and we should be budgeting for it.
Right.
So when we got around to reviewing our performance against that specific policy, we said, oops, we're not doing it. So that's what drove our making a hard and fast decision to do something, but not a lot of discussion.
Yeah, we set it as a board, when the board sets the budget parameters, we'll say we would like to include money for board training in the new fiscal year. So that's how we make sure that it gets included, because it is important. It's one of those things that is really important, not always urgent, but still very important. So another question came up is any suggestions for encouraging board members to attend more webinars, incorporating discussion and debriefs into your meetings? Neil's suggestion is a good alternative. It's kind of a comment and a question, but do you have any suggestions for how we get more board members to take advantage of these great resources that are out there?
Advocate, right? I mean, I think for a lot of us, the reason that we're here is because we've attended, a prior VSBA webinar, gone to an annual conference, participated in some sort of training, and we can come back and speak directly about the benefit of that. And I think it's, I've found that sharing that with my board colleagues, in a lot of cases has been sufficient enough to get them to engage and be willing to participate in some of these other things. We got to get the word out. And if you all find it valuable, then please, share that information with your board colleagues and let them know.
And it also could be a question of, how do people like to learn? That's sometimes what I'll ask a new board member who I don't know is, what is your preferred method of learning? There's so much to learn. There's so many ways to do it. Do you prefer to read a book? Do you prefer to watch webinars? Do you prefer to do some one-on-one coaching? So a lot of those, asking board members how they prefer to learn and then pointing them to the opportunities where they can do that, I think is important. Another question.
One possible idea on that is to start to reflect which board members have attended which sessions. Even if it's you're asking them to identify. We've started to do with community events, saying board members should go to community events, and so we have a sign up that is very public amongst the board members. And a questionnaire at each board meeting, which events did you go to? And so people start seeing that, it creates sort of a little bit more of a push. Maybe I should be doing this too.
Yeah, peer pressure. Mark, a question for you. Are your learning sessions generally standalone or their own series? Or do you find issues that are coming up that you then roll into your regular meetings? In other words, do they just generally improve understanding, or also do they lead to board action? That's a good question.
So usually it's our second meeting of the month, and we will
Mhm.
set aside, that is the first thing we do on our agenda. Um, Somebody said earlier that sometimes you run out of time, and that's the reason we put it first, is so that we don't
Yeah.
run out of time. The meeting might go long, but it's not that you get to like 8 o'clock and say, well, we're just going to skip training right now. Training's already done. We're at action items. We can't skip them. We just try and keep going. Um, Usually it's not action items that are being discussed. Sometimes they will lead to it. Like I was saying, when we talked to our auditors over the years, we have created education stabilization funds. We created a stabilization fund for our HRA usage based on their recommendations. And then we talked about it within our finance committee and then as a board as a whole over a number of months, whether or not we wanted to put that request before our voters to create new funding mechanisms. So it generates action sometimes, but mostly it's just for our own knowledge. So we'll have a presentation that might last half hour, 40 minutes, and then we have 10 to 20 minutes worth of discussion and questions, interaction so we better understand the topic and everyone gets to feel good about what's being going on.
Good. One other question somebody asked is, and you touched upon this, all of you, is how do you feel about using board meeting time to do training versus holding like a standalone retreat?
Like we were just saying, we're all busy people with so much other, trying to cram in another meeting is just hard, which is why we've tried to structure this in a way. We used to have one meeting a month, and it was very hard to try and do all that. So we made the decision that we're going to force ourselves to two smaller meetings. We try and do it in the roughly 2 hour meeting for each night, with the understanding that a part of that would be for training. And if we're in a crunch, last year we were trying to revote on budgets. Training went on the wayside because there was too much other things that were taking all of our bandwidth and time. Uh, but we have tried to create an expectation that this is how our first meeting of the month covers these various structural things that we need to cover as a board, and the second meeting of the month covers other things, including training.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just a formula we try and follow for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the idea of sprinkling it into meetings rather than having it happen like once a year and then people forget about it. If you spread it out in smaller doses, you sort of keep that momentum going of this continuous learning.
Mm-hmm.
We do one retreat a year for each of our boards, but that's usually very much a single topic, like DQS or something.
Mm-hmm.
And that we do find it's better to just slot it into existing board meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody wants to come to a regular board meeting. If you do a training board meeting, or suddenly people are going to have other things they need to do and not see it as a regular board meeting.
All right. Yeah. And if your board does have an annual retreat, sometimes that is part of your culture and your common practice is to have an annual retreat in the summer, for example, to plan for the coming year. You can always slip in some very purposeful, intentional training into the retreat. You could have an hour on a topic such as roles and responsibilities, if that's something you think your board needs before you jump into planning for the coming year. That's a nice way to do some of that training outside of a board meeting, but that would assume that you have a board retreat. Let me just quickly show you all before we close. I wanted just to give you the opportunity to see this slide. So if your board needs kind of some justification or rationale or some teeth to doing board training, the VSBA does have in its model policy manual a policy to consider, and it's under board operations. So these are policies that are written for the boards to consider. They're not required, they're not recommended, but they are kind of optional policies. So there's one called board member education that you're welcome to take a look at. And if you think it'd be helpful to adopt it for your board, it's just a nice way, again, to hold your board accountable for making sure that it does its continuous learning. And here, this is some of the language from A31, board education, board member education. I highlighted that last paragraph because I did want to tell you before we get to the end that even though training and professional development for boards is optional, there's actually one thing that is mandated in Vermont statutes, and that is annual joint training for school board chairs and superintendents. And the statute is here. And so for those of you who might be a new chair or might be a new board member, know that your chair and superintendent each year is supposed to have 8 years of professional training that addresses these 7 topics. And it's a big lift for many boards. However, there are ways you can get that training done pretty efficiently. One way is by attending the annual VSBA VSA conference, where we get that done in one day. So if your superintendent and chair attends together that annual conference, it's 8 hours of professional training. And we really try to make sure that we hit all 7 of these topics. So that's a great way for you just to get it done very efficiently in one go. And then also on the right side of your screen, you'll see this leadership expedition, which you can find on our website, which basically is a self-guide for boards and superintendents, board chairs and superintendents, kind of a menu of options of how you can meet the 8 hours of joint training. So for example, in addition to doing the VSBA VSA annual fall conference, this is where all the webinars are listed, and other ways that you can get the training done with your superintendent and hopefully touching on each of these topics. And then the second to last slide is what Jim was referring to earlier as a policy governance board. If you are one, and I know that there are a couple of you that are on here that are policy governance, this is an example of a policy governance policy, which is called governance investment. And so this is something that your board probably has. And if it doesn't, let me know, because we should make sure you have one. And it's called governance investment. And I just love the opening statement of this policy because it kind of sums it all up for all of us. Because poor governance costs more than learning to govern well, the board will invest in its governance capacity. I mean, it seems logical whether you're policy governance or traditional governance that says it right there. Finally, I wanted to let you know that training does not have to cost money. Except for 2 of these you see on the site, everything is free or is included with your membership with the VSBA. So check these things out. We are always available to answer questions on the phone, but most of these services that the VSBA offers are at no extra charge to our members. So we really encourage you to take advantage of all of these. And I'm not sure there's anything else left to say, except to say thank you to the panel, who was amazing. It looks like we lost Neil. But thank you very, very much for your time and sharing with us how your board does board training and development. And I know I took away a few key takeaways. So I hope we all have a chance to reflect on what you said and implement some of these great ideas that we heard about today. So thank you, Jim, and thank you, Mark, very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Debbie, and for everybody coming on board.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, participants. Thank you, viewers. Have a great day.